So here's the Merkava. It's a tank that most people can recognize fairly quickly because it looks quite different than most other tanks. The thing I noticed the most about this tank is how massive it actually is. Gives it a big hitbox for, I don't know, rockets. So if you've ever looked at the Israeli Merkava and thought, why the hell does this tank look so weird? Well, there's a really good reason for that. Actually, there are a bunch of reasons, and once you understand the history behind it, the whole thing suddenly makes a lot more sense. To really get where the Merkava comes from, you have to go all the way back, not to the 1970s or even the 60s, but all the way back to Israel's favorite decade, the 1940s, to the very beginning of Israel's armed forces. I'm talking about the late 1940s, just after Israel made its way to the world map. Back then, the Israeli Defense Forces, the IDF, didn't have much military hardware to work with. The first 30 tanks they had were actually old World War II era Shermans pulled from foreign scrapyards. They barely held together with hopes and prayers, just like the kippah on Jewish heads. God knows how it does not fall off at that angle. By 1955, the Israelis bought another 100 upgraded Shermans and 60 AMX-13s from France. This was enough to form a basic armored corps, but not enough to match their adversaries in the region. These vehicles weren't well suited to the terrain or the kind of high-intensity fighting Israel was likely to face. This became painfully obvious during the 1956 Suez Crisis, in which Israel joined forces with Great Britain and France to invade the Sinai Peninsula after the Egyptian president Gamal Abdel Nasser nationalized the Suez Canal. The Israeli Defense Forces launched a ground offensive into the Sinai Peninsula, and that's when they really came face to face with modern Soviet armor operated by Arab crews. By that point, the Egyptians were fielding T-34s, which were far better suited to desert combat, and even a handful of IS-3s, which were heavy tanks from the Soviet post-war era. In contrast, most of Israel's tanks were old M4 Shermans, the same from World War II. Some had been upgraded, but if we're honest, they were already a generation out of date by the mid-1950s. But then came the 144-hour war in 1967. Some rare-to-find minimalists call it the Six-Day War, which was a huge turning point for Israel both militarily and politically. After that war, under heavy pressure from Arab states, both Britain and France backed out of arms deals with Israel. This wasn't the first time foreign arms deals had fallen through for Israel, and the IDF was understandably frustrated. And that's when the idea of an Israeli tank, a fully indigenous one, stopped being a nice-to-have idea and instead became a strategic necessity. Because you can't base your defense around equipment that might never arrive, probably isn't designed for your specific needs, and is often already a generation behind by the time you get it. They needed something homegrown, something built specifically for their terrain, their military doctrine, and their strategic reality. And that's how the Merkava project started. By 1970, the decision was made for Israel to build its own main battle tank. Approval for the program was hard-won, but it was ultimately pushed through when the Soviet Union began delivering even newer T-62s to Israel's adversaries. The government allocated the equivalent of $100 million for development, which, for a country with a small industrial and economical foundation at the time, was a massive investment. For context, the US was working on the MBT-70 around the same time, and they burned through about $450 million before that project was scrapped. Meanwhile, Israel actually finished the Merkava for just $65 million. The Merkava was supposed to use primarily Israeli materials and technology so that an embargo wouldn't hamper their production and maintenance. It was also supposed to withstand the best Soviet tanks because the Soviets were selling their tanks to Syria and Egypt, which were Israel's main enemies at that time. I guess Syria is on that list again. While the Merkava was still being developed, the Yom Kippur War broke out in 1973. The IDF Armored Corps managed to hold back Egyptian T-55s and T-62s using upgraded Centurion tanks called Shotkal and patents known as Magach. But the price was high. More than 2,500 Israeli soldiers were killed and many of them were tankers. For a small country like Israel, that kind of loss was simply too much. It made it clear that the new tank had to focus on one thing above all: protecting the crew. They called the new tank Merkava, which means chariot in Hebrew. Leading the project was Major General Israel Tal, also known as Talik. He was a World War II veteran who fought in Jewish brigades in Italy, later became tank brigade commander in the IDF, and one of the main architects of Israel's armored doctrine. He understood tanks not just from a technical point of view, but from a tactical and strategic one too. He was known for thinking outside the box. More importantly, he understood what kind of tank Israel needed, and what it needed was very different from what other countries were building for. Western tank design, the American and German stuff, was mostly focused on stopping Soviet tanks in open field engagements across Europe. But Israel didn't fight like that. They dealt with ambushes, close quarter battles, surprise attacks, and the risk of being outnumbered. And unlike the US or USSR, Israel couldn't afford to lose experienced crew members because with a population like that, there just weren't many people to choose from. And the cost of training a new crew was also higher than making sure experienced crews were still alive. Therefore, the core philosophy was to protect the crew. So Talik made a radical decision. The Merkava wouldn't be designed around firepower, speed, or armor. It would be designed around the crew. The absolute top priority was crew survivability, because fact is, tanks can be repaired. But trained, experienced crew members are irreplaceable. And this philosophy shaped every part of the design. Probably the most famous example of this is the decision to put the engine in the front of the tank. That sounds like an adventurous idea at first, because almost no other modern tank does that, but when you think about it, it makes sense. Back then, composite armor was still pretty new and Israel didn't have the resources to develop it quickly, so the designers took a different approach. They made sure that every part of the tank would protect the crew in some way. That's why the engine and a fuel tank were placed in the front, not because it made the tank indestructible, but because they could help absorb or throw off heat rounds. This idea was partly inspired by the Swedish tactics with the STRV-103, where they used fuel-filled jerry cans to help reduce the impact of shaped charges. Having the engine in the front also frees up a lot of space in the back of the tank. That means the crew has more room to move around, stay comfortable, and do their jobs better and for longer without getting worn out. Having the engine in the front also frees up the rear of the tank for something else. And this is another unusual but clever feature. Because of the extra space in the back, the Merkava can actually carry infantry in addition to the four-man tank crew. Not a ton, usually up to 6 additional soldiers, but enough to either reinforce a position or evacuate wounded soldiers under fire. That rear compartment also allows for fast resupply thanks to a rear door that lets you throw in ammo blocks without exposing the crew or stopping for long. One important detail is that the driver sits in the same compartment as the rest of the crew. In most tanks, the driver is separated at the front, down in the hull of the tank. But here, the driver is part of the main crew compartment, and that makes a big difference psychologically. It helps with teamwork and morale. But of course, good morale isn't going to free the hostages, so they also build smart systems around the crew to protect them, like batteries, water tanks, fuel, and other gear, all placed in a way that creates a protective shield around the crew. This makes it more likely they'll survive even if the tank itself gets knocked out. Yes, some of the systems might be destroyed in a hit and the tank could be disabled, but the crew's chances of surviving are much higher, and we're going to see that in the survival data. Some of the design choices seem odd at first. For example, in many parts of the tank, the crew is surrounded by diesel fuel. When Israel started developing the Merkava, they didn't have access to Britain's advanced Chobham armor that uses layered materials. So instead, they used spaced armor, which means layers of steel with gaps in between. Then they filled those gaps with diesel. Because when a shell or rocket hits and gets through the first layer, the fuel spray can mess with the explosive jet like from a heat round or a fast-moving metal projectile. It disrupts the energy and makes the hit less deadly. Sure, this adds a risk of fire, but overall it actually protects the crew better. They also took notes from how American tanks were built. US tanks used hydraulic systems to move the turret. But when the turret got hit, the pressurized hydraulic fluid could spray inside the crew area as a fine mist, and that stuff is extremely flammable. This caused a lot of serious burn injuries to the American tank crews. To avoid that, the Merkava designers used a safer hydroelectric system. They also moved all the hydraulic parts to the back of the turret, placing them in a separate ring away from the crew. That way, even if something goes wrong, the dangerous fluid isn't near the people inside. To turn General Talik's vision into hardware, he was paired with an engineer, for some reason also nicknamed Talik, who translated those ideas into actual machinery. Development officially started in 1971, and around 200 Israeli companies were involved in producing parts, electronics, and systems. But the final assembly was handled by just one company, Israel Military Industries, the same people who built the Uzi submachine gun, the Galil assault rifle, the Desert Eagle, and other weapons. Production was supposed to begin in 1979, and it did, right on schedule. The first Merkava tanks rolled out of the gates in April that year and were publicly presented in May during Israel's independence celebrations. The moment was filled with a good amount of national pride and propaganda. The IDF demonstrated the tank unloading 10 fully equipped soldiers, even though in reality, even with all the ammunition taken out, the tank could comfortably carry only about 6 infantrymen. The Merkava's first opportunity to kill people was in June 1982 during Operation Peace for Galilee. Israeli forces invaded parts of Lebanon to break up Palestinian groups, and Syria soon joined the fight, turning it into a full-scale conflict. This was the Merkava's big test, and it performed well. Its armor handled attacks from RPGs and anti-tank guided missiles, and even Syria's strongest tank at the time, the T-72, couldn't gain a clear advantage over it. In total, 7 Merkavas were destroyed and an unknown number were damaged. The IDF deployed around 200 Merkavas alongside their older tanks, which made for a good comparison. Here's what the numbers showed. With older tanks, around 60% of hits led to armor penetrations. With the Merkava, that number dropped to 41%. More importantly, hits that actually reached the crew compartment went down from about 30% to just 13%, and the percentage of tanks catching fire dropped from 31% to just 15%. Coming from this statistic, 26% of soldiers suffered severe burns, while the number in the Merkava was at 0. As for firepower, the early Merkavas had a 105mm M68 gun, which was a very capable weapon at the time, and later versions moved to a locally built 120mm smoothbore compatible with NATO standard ammo mobility. Starting with the Mark III, the Merkava switched to a 120mm gun. Israel thought about building the American M256 under license, but instead chose to design their own version. They made sure it could still fire NATO standard shells, which meant that in an emergency, Israel could quickly get extra ammunition from US stockpiles without needing to change anything in their own production system. The Mark IV introduced the Trophy Active Protection System, which can detect incoming missiles or RPGs and destroy them mid-air before they hit the tank. It adds nearly a foot of width to each side of the turret and includes 4 radars covering a full 360-degree perimeter. The Merkava also has a soft kill countermeasure system at the front of the turret. If it detects a laser-guided missile, it can quickly launch smoke grenades that block the laser, making it hard for the missile to lock onto the tank. Now, of course, the Merkava isn't perfect. In today's battles, especially with more drones being used, even a low-cost drone carrying something like a mortar shell can cause serious damage if it lands on top of the turret. Another issue is the front-mounted engine. While it adds protection, it also makes the tank give off more heat in the front. That higher heat signature makes it easier for laser-guided weapons to spot and target the tank. The engine in the front used to be a big advantage because it added extra protection, but now it makes the tank give off more heat at the front. Most tanks are hottest at the back, since that's where the engine is, but with the Merkava the hottest part is up front, which makes it easier for thermal sensors to spot. And tanks aren't designed to fight while driving backwards.
Anyways, that was all I had to say for today's video. I hope you enjoyed it. If you think I said anything that is not right, or you think I should have added any additional information to this video, please let me know in the comments and share your knowledge. Besides that, thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.